After securing Greece, Alexander the Great stood at a point few rulers ever reach. His kingdom was stable. His enemies within Greece had been neutralized. His authority was no longer questioned. After the death of Philip II of Macedon, many expected fragmentation. Instead, what emerged was control. But control was not enough for Alexander, because control is maintenance. And he was not a maintainer of empires. He was a builder of expansion. Greece, for all its importance, was only the beginning. Its city-states had been unified under force and strategy, but they were still familiar ground, known politics, known rivals, known systems. Beyond Greece lay something entirely different. A structured empire that had existed long before his rise. An empire not built on cities, but on regions, cultures, and vast administrative control. That empire was the Achaemenid Empire. To remain in Greece would mean stability. To leave would mean transformation. And Alexander chose transformation, not because Greece was weak, but because it was finished. The next step was no longer about securing power. It was about expanding it into something larger than anything Greece had ever known. And that required crossing a line no Greek army had crossed in full conquest before, a line that separated familiarity from empire. The final phase of Greek consolidation did not feel like victory anymore. It felt like completion. Alexander the Great had achieved what Macedonian kings before him had only dreamed of: total Greek submission under one authority. The city-states that once defined conflict in the region were now subdued. Not erased, but controlled. The system was stable, predictable, manageable. And that predictability was the problem. Because Alexander did not see kingship as preservation. He saw it as momentum. After the death of Philip II of Macedon, the Macedonian system had evolved from regional dominance into something more ambitious. But ambition requires direction. And Greece could no longer provide that direction. There were no more internal challenges worth suppressing. No more alliances worth forming. No more rebellions worth crushing. The energy of conquest needed a new target. That target already existed beyond the horizon. The Persian system was not fragmented like Greece. It was centralized in structure and vast in scale, governed under one authority. Darius III move forward meant leaving behind everything familiar. It meant stepping into a world that did not operate by Greek logic, Greek warfare, or Greek politics. It meant entering empire territory. And once that step was taken, there would be no return to what came before. The moment of transition came at a narrow stretch of water, the Hellespont, a boundary between continents, between Europe and Asia, between known world and unknown empire. Alexander the Great arrived at this point not as a traveler, but as an invader of history itself. Behind him lay Greece, unified, controlled, and stable. Ahead of him lay Asia, vast, structured, and governed by centuries of imperial authority. The crossing was not rushed, it was deliberate, because moments like this are not just logistical, they are symbolic. Armies gathered at the shoreline. Soldiers prepared for movement into territory that represented uncertainty at scale. There was no clear end point, no guarantee of return, only forward movement. When the crossing began, it marked more than geography, it marked transformation. The Macedonian army was no longer operating within Greek political boundaries. It was entering the sphere of the Achaemenid Empire, a system built on vast territories, regional governors, and centralized imperial authority under Darius III. On the other side of the water, awareness began to spread, because empires do not ignore crossings like this. They observe them. They interpret them. They prepare responses. And as Alexander crossed, the nature of the conflict began to change. This was no longer Greek politics. It was imperial confrontation beginning to take shape. Once the crossing was complete, everything changed immediately. The familiar political environment of Greece disappeared. In its place stood structured imperial land controlled by regional systems tied to the Achaemenid Empire. Alexander the Great was now operating inside territory that was not politically neutral. It was governed, monitored, connected. Information about his arrival did not remain local for long. It moved through administrative networks toward the central authority. At the heart of that system stood Darius III. For the first time, Alexander was not an external rumor. He was a confirmed presence inside imperial space. However, No full military confrontation had yet occurred. This phase was defined by awareness, not war. Observation, not engagement. But in imperial systems, awareness always leads to reaction. Because once a threat is identified, it must be evaluated. And once it is evaluated, it must be answered. Persian regions began reporting movement. Military officials began preparing responses. Governors began assessing risk. Meanwhile, Alexander continued forward movement deeper into Asia, not rushing toward battle, but positioning himself for it. This was the beginning of a slow convergence, two systems moving toward contact. At this stage, something unusual defined the situation. There was no battle yet, but war had already begun in structure. Alexander the Great that was inside enemy space, and Darius III that was now fully aware of his presence. The Macedonian advance was no longer speculation. It was reality. But empires do not respond instantly. They process, they calculate, they prepare, which creates a dangerous pause, a moment where both sides understand what is coming. But neither has struck yet. Alexander is moving deeper into Asia. Persian forces are organizing responses. Regional tensions are rising. But the first true collision has not happened. And that is what makes this moment powerful. Because history is not defined only by battles. It is defined by anticipation. And anticipation at this scale means inevitability. Two worlds are now on a direct path toward conflict. One built on Greek unity. One built on imperial structure. And somewhere ahead, impact is coming. If Greece was just the beginning, then Asia is where history changes shape. Alexander the Great. The next chapter begins the moment empires collide for the first time. Subscribe. Because what comes next is not movement anymore. It is war.